He told her he never loved her. Now he's found the triplet sons he never knew existed. Skylar remembered every detail of that night as if it had been branded into her memory with fire. The city lights outside the tall windows of Elias's luxurious penthouse had looked like scattered stars, so close she could almost touch them. She had dreamed of a future with him, believed they were building something real together, something worth the sacrifices she made. She stood there, nervous but hopeful, fingers gently resting on her stomach because she already knew she was carrying a life that was half her and half him. She imagined his reaction, imagined joy and surprise lighting up those piercing blue eyes. That fantasy died the moment he walked in and didn't even look at her with affection. Elias McCabe, one of the youngest and most intimidating CEOs in the industry, was a man carved from ice and ambition. Everything about him was sharp, controlled, untouchable. Tonight he looked even more distant than usual, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, like he had made a decision he could not back away from. When he finally did raise his gaze to hers, there was no softness left in it. He said the words quietly, without anger, which only made them cut deeper. "I never loved you." For simple words that shattered every belief she had clung to. Skylar stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was a cruel joke, that he was pushing her away out of fear rather than truth. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up. She wasn't the kind of woman who begged, yet in that moment she almost did. She thought about telling him she was pregnant, thought about reaching for him and reminding him of every gentle moment they once shared, every night he pulled her close as if he couldn't breathe without her. Instead she saw a stranger where her love used to be. The pain was too raw, too humiliating, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her brown hair fell like a curtain as she lowered her head, hoping it would hide the tears welling in her eyes. She managed a single nod, a small acknowledgement that she understood. She turned and walked toward the elevator, fingers trembling as she pressed the button. Behind her, Elias remained silent, a statue of power and indifference, watching the woman he should have fought for leave without a word. The doors slid shut between them, and Skylar felt something inside her close forever. The moment she stepped outside into the cold night air, the first tear escaped despite her efforts. She hugged her coat tighter around herself, one protective hand instinctively covering her stomach. The city noise blurred around her as she tried to steady her breathing. She told herself she would not collapse, not here, not now. The life growing inside her needed strength, not despair. She promised silently that she would give her child everything, even if she had nothing left to give. She whispered that she would never let anyone hurt them the way she had just been hurt. A taxi slowed beside her, and she climbed in without looking back. Her heart begged her to turn around, to give him one last chance to call her name, to run after her like in the stories. He didn't. The driver asked, where to, and she gave him the address of the tiny apartment she could barely afford. While the city sped past the windows, she let herself cry quietly, each tear a farewell to the future she once believed in. She pressed a palm to her belly and tried to smile for the tiny heartbeat she had just begun to sense. "You will be loved," she promised. Even if she had to fight the entire world, her children would never feel unwanted. She would rise again, stronger than anyone expected, because she no longer lived only for herself. That night might have broken her heart, but it forged her courage. Elias McCabe could choose to live without love. She no longer had that option. Her children would become her reason to breathe, and they would grow up never knowing how deeply their father once failed them. Skylar closed her eyes, knowing this was the end of one life and the painful birth of another. She had no idea how she would survive, but she already knew why she must. Skylar never imagined how drastically her life would change in just a few short months. Her pregnancy progressed faster than she was prepared for, and every doctor's appointment seemed to bring one surprise after another. The biggest shock came when the ultrasound technician stared at the monitor longer than usual, tilting her head and narrowing her eyes at the screen. Skylar's heartbeat sped up, terrified that something was wrong. The technician finally let out a small laugh of disbelief and turned the screen toward her, pointing to 3 tiny shapes. Skylar blinked as her mind struggled to catch up. 3 babies. 3 lives. Not just 1 heartbeat, but 3, fluttering wildly like butterflies. She sat there frozen in awe and fear while the technician explained that she was carrying identical triplet boys, a rare occurrence in itself. Skylar walked out of the clinic with trembling legs and a swirl of emotions, realizing that her life had just become 3 times more beautiful and 3 times more terrifying. During the pregnancy she worked harder than ever, pushing her body beyond limits simply to afford food and medical checkups. Every morning she woke before sunrise to clean offices when no one else was around. Then she worked long hours as a waitress, smiling at customers through exhaustion. After that, she went home to sew handmade items to sell online. Her back ached constantly, her feet swelled, and there were nights when she cried herself to sleep because she didn't know how she would manage tomorrow. Still, whenever she felt 3 strong kicks inside her, she reminded herself that she wasn't alone. Her boys were fighting with her, growing stronger each day, and she promised them that she would keep going no matter what. The day they were born, the world felt like it held its breath just for them. The delivery room exploded into chaos as doctors and nurses rushed in circles, preparing for a high-risk birth. Skylar lay on the hospital bed shaking from fear but refusing to let it overwhelm her. She gripped the sheets and focused on her breathing while her heart pounded like a drum. One after another, her sons entered the world with loud cries that filled the room, their tiny fists clenched as if ready to conquer whatever awaited them. Liam came first, then Lucas, then Landon. All 3 blonde, all 3 blue-eyed, each perfect in a way that made Skylar forget every sacrifice she had ever made. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held them for the first time. They were so small, yet somehow they made her world feel vast and full of hope. Raising 3 newborns on her own was a challenge no one could have prepared her for. Sleep became a luxury she rarely experienced. Nights merged with days in a blur of feeding bottles, changing diapers, washing clothes, and rocking her babies until her arms went numb. She moved through life like someone underwater, exhausted but still moving forward because stopping wasn't an option. She learned to feed 2 boys at once while holding the 3rd close to her chest, humming soft lullabies she barely remembered. Sometimes she would stare at them while they all slept side by side, identical little faces relaxed and peaceful, breathing in perfect rhythm. In those moments she felt something stronger than fatigue. She felt pride. She had brought 3 miracles into the world, and they were hers. Money was always the enemy. Rent, formula, medicine, clothing, daycare fees that she could rarely afford, every bill felt like a mountain she had to scale alone. Skylar learned to stretch every dollar until it nearly ripped. She skipped meals so her sons would never go hungry. She bought second-hand clothing and fixed broken cribs that others threw away. At times she wondered if she was enough for them, if her love could outweigh everything they lacked compared to children who had 2 parents and financial stability. Each time those doubts tried to take root, one of her boys would flash her a sleepy smile, or reach out tiny arms to her, and in that instant the world made sense again. No matter how difficult the days were, Skylar refused to let bitterness consume her. She never spoke Elias's name aloud. She never allowed herself to dwell on how easily he had dismissed her or how different life might have been if he had chosen love instead of pride. Instead she focused on teaching her sons laughter, patience, and comfort. They learned to say "Mama" before they could walk, often chanting it together as if it were their favorite word. When they took their first steps, it was toward her open arms. Every milestone reminded her that she was not failing. She was building a family, even if it looked nothing like she once imagined. When the boys turned 3, their personalities began to shine brightly. Liam was the bravest, always protecting his brothers and climbing furniture taller than he was. Lucas became the little thinker, carefully examining toys and puzzles with a focus far beyond his age. Landon was the most affectionate, constantly hugging her legs or resting his head on her shoulder whenever she paused her work. Together they created noise, chaos, and endless energy, but they also filled her heart with a joy so powerful it erased every doubt. Skylar sometimes watched them play near the window of their small apartment, golden sunlight reflecting in their hair, and wondered if Elias would ever regret pushing them away before they even had the chance to exist. She wondered if he would ever look into a mirror and finally see the eyes of 3 little boys staring back. She didn't want his money or his affection, but there were times she hurt for her sons, knowing they had a father who didn't even know how extraordinary they were. Still, she stood tall, because she was both mother and father now. The struggle shaped her into someone strong, unbreakable, and determined. Each night she kissed her sons goodnight, smoothing their soft blonde hair and whispering that they were loved more than they could ever understand. She promised them a future brighter than their beginnings, even if she had to build it with shaking hands. Life might have stolen her dreams, but it gave her something far better: 3 reasons to keep fighting. Elias McCabe had everything a man could outwardly want. His name appeared regularly in financial magazines, investors sought his approval, and his company's rising success fed his ego like a constant applause. People admired his confidence, his decisiveness, and the discipline that drove him toward perfection. Yet every night he returned to an empty penthouse that echoed more loudly with silence than he ever admitted. He had built a life surrounded by glass and steel, but nothing warm or human seemed to survive in it. He told himself loneliness was strength. He convinced himself that attachments were distractions. For 3 years he survived on that belief, never questioning it, until small cracks began to appear in the walls he constructed around his heart. It started with memories he couldn't quite bury. A laugh coming from someone across the lobby that sounded just like hers made his chest tighten. A perfume that resembled Skylar's would drift through an elevator, and suddenly his mind would drown in flashes of what he'd thrown away. At business events he found himself surrounded by beautiful women dressed in diamonds and designer gowns, yet not one of them had the softness that used to light his world with a single smile. He tried to ignore the void she left behind, especially when it became unbearable. He worked longer hours, traveled more, drowned his nights in expensive liquor, and pretended he didn't notice how meaningless it all felt. Elias never spoke about Skylar. To his colleagues she didn't exist. To himself she existed too much. He told himself he didn't regret pushing her away, that love was weakness, that success demanded sacrifice, but deep down he could not forget the look in her eyes the night she walked out of his life. He had assumed she would break, call him, come crawling back, but she vanished without a trace, leaving him to face a truth he never anticipated. He hadn't just let her go. He had lost something irreplaceable. One rainy evening, as he sorted through old personal files in search of a document, a small photograph slipped from the folder and fluttered to the floor at his feet. He leaned down to pick it up, and the moment his fingers touched the glossy surface, he felt as if air had been punched from his lungs. It was the only picture he had of her. Skylar sat in a park laughing at something behind the camera, sunlight reflecting in her brown eyes, hair blowing wildly across her face. She looked alive, free, everything he wasn't. Elias stared at the photograph far too long, unable to look away. It was then that the truth he had been avoiding finally rose inside him with brutal clarity. He loved her. He always had. His denial, his pride, his obsession with power had blinded him so completely that by the time he realized what she meant, she was already gone. From that night forward, something changed in him. He tried to find her quietly, telling himself it was for closure or simply to satisfy curiosity. He hired private investigators, scanned public records, and attended charity events she had once liked in hopes that she might appear again. Each dead end twisted the knife a little deeper. Every time someone said there was no trace of a woman named Skylar who matched his description, he wondered whether she had left the state or even the country. She had disappeared from his world so fully that it frightened him to imagine what she must have endured alone. He had no idea she had carried a secret far bigger than heartbreak away with her. Work became harder to focus on as his thoughts drifted constantly to her. He found himself pausing in meetings, staring out of windows, imagining what life could have looked like if he had chosen differently. His friends noticed his temper growing shorter, his nights ending earlier, his laughter almost entirely gone. The man who once felt invincible began to crumble under the quiet weight of regret. Elias wondered if she ever thought of him, if she hated him, if she had moved on and found happiness with someone who wouldn't throw her away like he did. Sometimes he imagined a future where she returned, maybe angry, maybe hurt, but still willing to give him another chance. On darker nights he imagined her gone forever, beyond reach. Those were the nights when he stayed up until dawn, unable to escape the knowledge that his greatest achievement meant nothing compared to the greatest mistake he had made. Behind the sharp suits and confident voice lived a man haunted by love he pretended didn't matter. He began to feel the disconnect between the life he showcased and the life he endured. Money couldn't silence guilt. Success couldn't fill emptiness. Applause couldn't replace the woman he once held in his arms. Elias McCabe was admired by thousands, yet not loved by the one person who mattered most. He had built his empire on the belief that love was a weakness, but now he understood that the real weakness was losing it. While he continued searching in the shadows of his past, he remained unaware that just a few miles away, 3 little boys were growing older each day, each one carrying his face and his eyes. He had spent years believing he controlled every outcome in his life, yet the most important part of his story was living outside his knowledge entirely, waiting for the moment when fate would force him to face the consequences of the night he said 4 unforgivable words. One day soon, the truth would finally find him. Skylar had always known that raising 3 boys alone would demand every ounce of strength she had, but she never realized how fragile a human body could be when pushed beyond its limits. For 3 years she survived on minimal sleep, cheap instant meals, constant worry about bills, and a heart that never fully healed. She ignored the dizziness that crept into her days, the fatigue that settled deep in her bones, and the sharp pains that would shoot through her sides whenever she lifted one of the boys. She chalked it all up to exhaustion, convinced that a single mother simply didn't have the luxury of rest. The truth she tried to outrun finally caught her. One afternoon, while preparing lunch for the boys, her hands began to shake so violently that the spoon slipped from her fingers. The room spun before her eyes, and an unbearable pressure tightened around her chest. She collapsed to the kitchen floor, hearing the terrified shouts of her sons as their little feet scrambled across the tiles toward her. The hospital smelled of sterile chemicals and fear. Skylar lay in a bed with wires attached to her body and in dripping life back into her veins. The doctor explained that her health had been deteriorating for a long time. Severe anemia. Heart strain. Malnutrition. Her body was breaking down because she had given everything to her children and kept nothing for herself. She listened with a silent nod, guilt washing over her. She felt she had failed not only herself but also her sons. The boys sat near her bed, their identical faces streaked with tears, too young to understand what was happening but old enough to feel terror. When a nurse tried to lead them out so the doctor could speak privately, Liam refused to let go of his mother's hand. Lucas climbed onto the mattress and curled beside her arm, while Landon buried his face against her shoulder, sobbing quietly. Skylar wrapped her arms around all 3, forcing a brave smile even as fear twisted inside her. The doctors warned her that without expensive treatment and recovery time she would only get worse. Her heart might not withstand another collapse. Skylar stared at the medical bills that piled up at the end of her bed. The numbers looked like a foreign language she could never hope to learn. Her paycheck from 3 jobs already disappeared the moment she earned it. She didn't qualify for many government programs because she was always working, always managing just above the line where help was offered. The system didn't reward people who never stopped trying. It only punished them for not sinking low enough to deserve assistance. She cried in the dark of night when her children slept, silent tears sliding down her cheeks as she wondered what would become of them if she died. She thought of friends, but she had none close enough to ask for such tremendous help. Skylar had built her life around her children, shutting out almost everyone else, afraid that any weakness would be exploited. The only person who truly should have been there was the last person she wanted to face. She tried to convince herself that Elias didn't deserve to know, didn't deserve them. He had chosen to walk away before he even knew they existed. She had spent years telling herself that letting go of him was liberation, but now, with her body failing and her sons clinging to her helplessly, she felt cornered by reality. Pride couldn't buy medicine. Independence couldn't pay for surgeries. Stubbornness couldn't guarantee her children's future. The boys sensed her fear even if she tried to hide it. One night, as they slept in chairs pushed together, their tiny bodies curled against one another for comfort, Skylar brushed a soft kiss across each of their foreheads and whispered apologies for not being stronger. She watched their peaceful faces glow under the faint hospital lights and felt a deep, powerful love that hurt more than any illness ever could. They deserved a mother who would be around to see them grow, who would cheer at their school plays and patch their scraped knees and hold them when the world felt too big. Skylar vowed she would not let her illness steal those moments away. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a pen. A blank sheet of paper stared back at her with cruel simplicity. Her heart pounded with dread, but she forced herself to write. She told Elias that he had sons, that they were beautiful and spirited and perfect in ways he couldn't imagine. She wrote that she wasn't asking him to love her or even them, but that the boys deserved to have a mother, and she needed his help to stay alive for them. Every sentence tasted like humiliation. Every stroke of the pen felt like reopening a wound she spent years trying to heal. By the time she finished, tears dotted the page and blurred the ink. Skylar sealed the letter before she could change her mind. She stared at it for a long time, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. She didn't know how Elias would react, whether he would be furious, indifferent, or shocked. She didn't know if he would believe her or accuse her of manipulation. She only knew that this was her last hope. She walked slowly to the mailbox outside the hospital, each step weaker than the last, and slipped the envelope inside. Her hand lingered for a moment against the cold metal surface as if holding on just a second longer could change fate. Then she let go. The letter disappeared into the darkness of the chute, carrying her final plea toward the man who once claimed he never loved her, and who never knew that he had already abandoned more than just a woman. Skylar whispered a desperate prayer to whatever force might be listening, hoping that for once in her life, fate would show mercy. Elias received the letter on a quiet afternoon when the world seemed determined to test his patience. His assistant had placed a bundle of envelopes on his desk, most of them business-related, demanding signatures or decisions that held the weight of millions. He scanned through them without much interest, but then his fingers stopped on an envelope with his full name written in a shaky hand that made something flicker in his chest. He almost ignored it, assuming it was just another plea for charity or an old acquaintance seeking help, yet something compelled him to slice it open. The first sentence he read felt like a lightning strike to the heart. He reread it once, twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. Skylar. 3 sons. His sons. His breath caught violently in his throat as he leaned back in his chair and scanned every heartbreaking line. She hadn't demanded anything. She hadn't cursed him or thrown accusations. She simply begged for the chance to live long enough to raise the children he never knew existed. Elias's vision blurred. His pulse thundered in his ears. He barely remembered grabbing his coat or ordering his driver to find the hospital mentioned in the letter. The ride felt endless, each passing street stretching like a punishment for his ignorance. What if he was too late? What if his sons never knew their father because he had pushed away the only woman who ever cared for him? His thoughts spiraled into panic, guilt clawing its way up his throat until he could hardly breathe. When he reached the hospital, he almost ran to the reception desk, his voice shaking as he asked for Skylar's room. Nurses recognized the urgency in his eyes and pointed him toward the elevator. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, but faint sounds ahead made him slow. It wasn't Skylar's voice he heard. It was laughter. Soft, clumsy, high-pitched giggles only toddlers could produce. He turned toward the sound, and his heart stopped. 3 small boys sat on the floor near the door to their mother's room, playing with colored blocks and babbling to each other, unaware of his arrival. Elias stared at them, trying to comprehend the impossible. They were identical, each with silky blonde hair as pale as his had been at their age and eyes so blue they might have been reflections of his own. They were his mirror image split 3 ways. The realization hit him with such force that he braced himself against the wall, terrified he might collapse under the weight of it. One of the boys, the one with the most serious expression, noticed him first. Their eyes met, and the child tilted his head with a confused curiosity before timidly calling his brothers closer. Slowly, all 3 turned to face Elias. In that instant, everything he ever valued or believed about himself crumbled. These children had grown for 3 years without the love, protection, or presence of a father who should have been there from the beginning. Elias felt the sharpest regret he had ever experienced as he dropped to his knees so he wouldn't tower over them like some stranger intruding on their world. The children didn't approach him at first. Their big eyes studied him, hesitant and cautious. He whispered a quiet hello that trembled with emotion he could no longer hide. Liam, the brave one, took a small step forward and stopped just within arm's reach. Lucas followed with cautious curiosity, while Landon clung to his brothers, watching with uncertainty. Elias's throat tightened painfully as he reached out a hand, but he didn't dare touch them. He didn't feel deserving of even the smallest embrace. He wished he could turn back time, wished he could take back the night he told their mother those cruel words. It sickened him to realize he had not only hurt Skylar but also these boys who shared his blood, his features, and deserved far better. The door behind them opened slightly, and Skylar stood in the doorway, still wearing her hospital gown, pale but fierce in the way only a mother trying to stay strong for her children could be. The sight of her nearly broke him. She froze when she saw him kneeling there, and her hand gripped the edge of the door for support. Their eyes met for the first time in years, and the silence that filled the hallway was heavy with everything they never said. Elias stood, slowly, carefully, terrified that one wrong move might shatter her completely. He approached only a step, not daring to push further than she allowed. Skylar's voice, when it finally came, was tired and guarded, stripped of the warmth he once took for granted. She told the boys to stay close, and they pressed around her legs like a protective shield. Elias introduced himself awkwardly, his tone unsteady, trying to make sense of this new reality. He confessed that he had been searching for her, that he never imagined something like this. She did not soften. She reminded him that she came not for forgiveness or second chances but because their children deserved to keep their mother, and she no longer had a way to guarantee that alone. Her honesty cut deeper than any insult. Elias looked at the boys again, now clinging to her gown, staring up at him with the same eyes that haunted his reflection every morning. For the first time in his life, his priorities aligned with absolute clarity. He wanted to protect them. He wanted to save her. He wanted to earn the right to be part of their lives, even if he had to fight every day to prove he wasn't the selfish man who once let them slip away before they were born. He promised Skylar he would take responsibility, that he would secure the best treatment available for her, that he would never walk away again. She didn't believe him yet, and he couldn't expect her to. Trust wasn't something he could ask for. It was something he would have to rebuild from nothing. While Skylar guided the boys back into her room, Elias watched them with a sense of awe and overwhelming sorrow. He knew this was the beginning of a long and painful journey, but for the first time in years, his heart wasn't empty. It was terrified, guilty, and determined, but it was alive. He whispered something so softly that no one else could hear it. He vowed that he would learn how to be a father. He vowed that he would never again turn away from the family he almost destroyed. The hallway remained quiet after he stepped inside, but something monumental had shifted in the world. 3 little boys had unknowingly changed everything with the simple act of existing. Elias moved Skylar and the boys into his home within days, refusing to entertain any arguments. The doctors had insisted on a long recovery period, and he had no intention of letting her return to a life that was slowly killing her. His penthouse, once a cold monument to wealth and ego, transformed overnight into something entirely different. Toys scattered across polished marble floors, tiny socks draped over designer furniture, and laughter echoing through the once silent halls created a chaos he never knew he needed. For the first time in his life, he woke up to the sound of footsteps and voices instead of the hum of electronics and the quiet ringing of loneliness. He discovered, rather abruptly, that children did not care if someone was a CEO or a janitor. They only cared if he could tie their shoes correctly or read their favorite book in a silly voice. At first the boys kept their distance emotionally, even though they lived under the same roof. Liam watched him suspiciously, trying to gauge whether he was friend or stranger. Lucas observed him with thoughtful eyes, trying to solve the puzzle of a father who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Landon clung to Skylar, hiding behind her whenever Elias came too close. It hurt him more than he expected. He understood he had no right to feel wounded, not after missing 3 years of their lives, yet the distance from his own children carved painful marks inside him. He decided he would earn every step they took toward him, one effort at a time. Learning to care for them was nothing like running a business. In meetings he commanded respect with a glance, but with toddlers he found himself kneeling on the floor surrounded by spilled juice, assembling complicated toys with missing instructions, or trying to calm 3 simultaneous tantrums that made any corporate crisis look easy. He failed constantly. He burned breakfast, put diapers on backward, and misread their cues so often that the boys stared at him like he was a slightly malfunctioning robot. The first time he tried to bathe them alone, the bathroom turned into a flood zone complete with soap bubbles floating toward the chandelier while 3 giggling boys sprinted through the hall naked and dripping. Elias stood drenched, watching them disappear and wondering how someone with an Ivy League education could be so utterly defeated by toddlers. Yet every disaster taught him something. Slowly, the boys began looking to him for help instead of avoiding him. They let him sit with them during meals and fell asleep on his lap when they were too tired to resist. The first night that happened, Landon curled up against his chest while Lucas and Liam shared his arm as a pillow. Elias remained still for hours, afraid to move even slightly, because the weight of their trust on his body felt like the greatest honor he had ever received. His heart ached with regret but also filled with a kind of love he had never known before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and unconditional, demanding nothing in return. Skylar watched quietly from a distance. While she recovered, she learned to surrender responsibility little by little, though giving up control was harder for her than any physical therapy. She saw how Elias tried to adapt, how his once flawless appearance became rumpled by sticky hands tugging at his clothes, and how exhaustion settled under his eyes as he woke up each time one of the boys cried during the night. He didn't complain. He didn't disappear. He showed up day after day, even when the boys pushed him away or when Skylar found it difficult to meet his gaze. There were moments when she allowed herself to believe that maybe he wasn't the heartless man who once shut her out. The doctors were astonished by her rapid improvement once she was surrounded by stability, proper nutrition, and real rest for the first time since she became a mother. Color returned to her cheeks. Her strength grew each week. She still felt fragile at times, but the terror that once held her hostage loosened its grip. She found herself observing Elias in ways she didn't expect. When he knelt to tie a loose shoelace or wiped tears from a scraped knee without flinching, she felt unfamiliar warmth tug at the guarded walls around her heart. She didn't know what to do with that feeling, and she tried to bury it whenever it surfaced. Elias struggled not only with childcare but with emotional growth. He attended parenting classes in secret, sitting among exhausted single mothers and clueless fathers who all looked equally overwhelmed. He read books about bonding with children and healthy attachments, highlighting passages that taught him how to undo what he had ruined by being absent for so long. Every night he promised himself that he would become worthy of being called their father. In quiet hours after everyone slept, he would stand near the boys' beds, brushing hair from their foreheads as he memorized every tiny detail he had missed since the day they were born. He vowed he would never allow another birthday or milestone to pass without being there. The relationship between him and Skylar was fragile, complicated, and layered with years of hurt. There were days when she barely spoke to him, days when resentment slipped into her voice, and days when she wondered if accepting his help was a mistake. Yet there were also moments when she caught him smiling at the boys, eyes filling with pride and an ache of what-ifs, and she felt her anger soften despite her best efforts. She wanted to protect her heart, but she couldn't deny that the man standing in front of her was fighting for their family in a way she once believed him incapable of. Forgiveness still felt far away, but she couldn't ignore the growing evidence that people, even the most stubborn ones, could change when life finally forced them to confront what truly mattered. Elias had spent years worshipping success, but now success meant something entirely different. It wasn't numbers on a stock report or applause from shareholders. It was Lucas reaching for his hand without hesitation. It was Liam calling him "Daddy" for the first time in the middle of playing superheroes, the word spoken casually but carrying the power to bring Elias to his knees. It was Landon falling asleep in his arms, trusting him to keep the nightmares away. These moments rewrote the definition of winning in his mind. His empire had once made him feel superior. These boys made him feel human. Skylar's recovery mirrored the healing happening quietly between them all. Their home became a place of laughter, vulnerability, and second chances. And although deep scars still lingered between Skylar and Elias, something bigger than their pain began to grow in the spaces where silence used to dominate. Without even realizing it, they were becoming a family. Elias had begun to believe that life was finally steering him in the right direction, yet underneath the progress he made there remained a constant tension that neither he nor Skylar dared to ignore. Trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered and painfully slow to rebuild, and Skylar's heart still carried the memory of his rejection like a scar that refused to fade. Sometimes, when she looked at him, he could see the storm of emotions swirling behind her eyes: gratitude, fear, resentment, affection that she tried so desperately to deny. He knew she questioned every move he made, waiting to see whether this version of him was temporary or real. That knowledge weighed on him heavily, pushing him to work harder not only for their children but for her forgiveness, though he feared he might never deserve it. One night, after she had finished her rehabilitation exercises and the boys were asleep in their shared room, Skylar sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, her body stronger but her spirit still healing. She stared at the city lights with a mixture of wonder and caution, trying to absorb the reality that her world had changed so drastically. Elias stepped outside quietly, holding 2 cups of tea, and she accepted one without protest. The silence between them felt more comfortable than usual, though there was still an invisible line neither was ready to cross. For a long moment they simply existed side by side, sharing the night air like 2 people who remembered how to be near each other without hurting. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft yet filled with a weight that settled deep into his chest. She told him she didn't want promises he couldn't keep and that she didn't want her heart broken again, because this time the boys would break with her. Elias listened without interrupting, his hand tightening around his cup as guilt tightened around his ribs. He confessed that he didn't expect forgiveness and that he could barely forgive himself. He admitted that he had been a coward who ran from the possibility of love because love made him vulnerable, and he had spent his life convinced vulnerability was a flaw. Skylar listened, her expression unreadable, though her eyes glistened with a mixture of pain and understanding. He told her he would spend every day proving he was no longer that man, that he would give up everything he ever built if it meant protecting the family standing in front of him. She didn't answer immediately. Her heart wanted to believe him, but memory reminded her of the night he let her go as if she were nothing. Finally, she told him that actions mattered more than beautiful words. He nodded because he knew she was right. From that moment he focused even more intensely on showing change rather than speaking it. He rearranged his priorities completely. Company executives were stunned when he announced that he was stepping down from his role as CEO. Shareholders protested, friends called him reckless, and the media speculated endlessly, but none of that mattered. He had spent years chasing power, but power had never filled the emptiness love had left behind. Trading his title for a chance to fix what he broke felt less like a sacrifice and more like a liberation. Quitting gave him something he had never felt before: time. He learned to braid hair for the first time when Liam insisted that superhero capes looked better with styled hair. He took Lucas to a science museum and spent an entire afternoon answering curious questions that made him laugh harder than he ever did in a boardroom. He carried Landon through the house when nightmares woke the boy in tears, whispering comfort while rocking him back to sleep. Each small moment was an act of healing, one that stitched their family together with invisible thread. Skylar noticed it all, though she tried not to show how deeply it affected her. Still, healing was not a simple climb upward. There were nights when Skylar woke from dreams she couldn't escape, hearing his voice echo, "I never loved you," as clearly as the night he first said it. She would step away from him, wrap her arms around herself, and doubt everything again. Elias learned to give her space in those moments, but it tore at him to see how deeply he had damaged her. When she finally told him one evening that she still feared waking up alone again, he promised, gently, that he would always remain within reach. That night he slept in a chair near her bed, not touching her, but refusing to leave her side. When she opened her eyes in the morning and saw him still there, the tremble in her breath revealed how much that simple choice meant. Every improvement in their lives came layered with emotional struggle, forcing both of them to face the consequences of his past. Elias attended therapy, something he once mocked as unnecessary. He confronted a counselor about his deeply rooted fear of intimacy and his flawed belief that emotions made a person weak. He realized he had spent his entire upbringing being rewarded for control and punished for softness, shaping him into someone who believed love was a liability. Each session stripped away more of the armor he had spent years forging around himself, leaving a man who could finally feel without running away. Skylar's heart remained cautious, but day after day she saw sincerity in his efforts. She saw how his eyes lit up when the boys called him daddy, how he smiled only when they were near, how his hands always reached out to catch them if they stumbled. She noticed the vulnerability in his apologies and the determination in his growth. Slowly, against her will, hope crept back into her chest. It scared her almost as much as losing him once did, but she could no longer deny the shift in the air between them. Still, the hardest truth remained unspoken until one quiet evening when fear drove her to finally name it. She admitted that part of her would always remember what he said the night he pushed her away, and that no matter how much changed, a shadow of that pain might remain forever. Elias didn't try to wipe it away or pretend that he could. Instead, he told her he would live his life proving that the man she met now was the real one, the one she deserved from the beginning, the one who would never again mistake love for a weakness. He promised to earn every piece of trust she chose to give him. Skylar didn't respond right away, but she didn't shut him out either. The act of staying next to him, of continuing to build a life together, was her quiet way of saying she still believed a better ending was possible. In the soft, unpredictable space between heartbreak and healing, love began rewriting its story in them both. Elias planned the day with more care than he had ever put into any business deal, not because he feared failure but because he wanted every second to reflect the love he could finally acknowledge without hesitation. A year of rebuilding their lives had transformed them all. Skylar's strength had returned fully, not only in her body but in her eyes, which no longer carried the same constant exhaustion. The boys were lively and adventurous, racing through each day with an energy that often overwhelmed him in the most wonderful way. The home they shared no longer felt like his alone. It was filled with drawings taped to walls, mismatched furniture chosen for comfort instead of luxury, and laughter that seemed to live in every corner. Elias had discovered that happiness wasn't a prize earned through power but a space created by the people who filled it with meaning. He chose a quiet park for their family picnic, a place shaded by tall oak trees and alive with sunlight streaming through the leaves. Skylar packed the basket while he gathered the boys, who were already bouncing with excitement, arguing over who would get the biggest cookie. The sky was clear, and the air smelled like fresh grass and blooming flowers, the kind of day that felt like a promise all by itself. Once they settled on a blanket, the boys ran to chase butterflies while Elias and Skylar watched them with a shared smile that needed no explanation. They didn't speak about the past anymore. It existed but no longer controlled them. Their conversations were now built around school plans, silly stories, favorite meals, and little dreams that had room to grow. As they ate and played, Elias found himself studying Skylar, memorizing the softness of her expression and the relaxed curve of her shoulders. There was a time when pain had wrapped around her like armor, and he could still see the traces of those battles she fought alone, but now joy was layered over them, creating something beautifully strong. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow in amusement, which made him laugh and look away for a moment. His heart raced with anticipation, knowing what he was about to do and how much it would mean if she accepted. He waited until the boys were distracted with a pile of leaves and sticks that had magically become pirate treasure and then stood slowly, his hands trembling just enough that he tucked them into his pockets while he steadied himself. Skylar glanced up at him, puzzled as he took a deep breath. He asked her to stand too, and she did so cautiously, recognizing a shift in the moment even before she understood what was happening. Elias reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small box he had carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. His voice wavered as he began speaking, not in an eloquent rehearsed speech but in a raw sincerity that came straight from the place he once hid from everyone, including himself. He told her that he had built empires and chased greatness, but none of it ever felt like enough until he became part of a family with her and their boys. He admitted that he could never erase the pain he caused, but he could promise that every day forward would be dedicated to love, patience, and protecting the life they built together. The boys noticed the sudden stillness and turned to watch, surprise widening their bright blue eyes as they realized something big was happening. Elias knelt down on one knee, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He held out the ring with a shaking hand and asked Skylar to marry him, his voice barely louder than a whisper but full of hope that echoed louder than any word he had ever spoken. For a breathless moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. Skylar covered her mouth with her hands as tears welled up, the kind that belonged not to heartbreak but to healing that had finally reached its completion. She remembered everything: the night he rejected her, the years of fear and struggle, the quiet transformation she witnessed day by day. Yet she also saw the man kneeling before her now, a man who chose love over pride, a man who learned fatherhood without running, a man who fought to earn back her trust and their future. Her tears spilled freely as she lowered her hands and nodded, her voice barely steady as she whispered yes, a word that seemed to carry all the strength she had gained through survival. The boys erupted in joyful squeals and rushed at them, jumping onto their father before he could even stand, knocking him back with giggles and excitement. Elias laughed, wrapping his arms around the children, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of love that crashed over him. Skylar joined the pile a second later, and somehow they all ended up hugging in a tangled mess of arms and laughter, the kind of moment that felt too perfect to belong to reality. As they sat together afterward, Elias slipped the ring onto Skylar's finger while the boys leaned against them, exhausted from celebration. The sunlight made the diamond sparkle, but it was the warmth in her eyes that truly made his chest tighten with gratitude. Skylar laid her head on his shoulder, finally allowing herself to rest against him without fear that he might disappear. Elias pressed a gentle kiss to her hair, promising silently that this was the beginning of a life he would honor with everything he had. The day ended with the boys asleep in the back seat on the drive home, their peaceful breathing a reminder of how far they had come. When Elias parked in front of their home, he paused before waking anyone, glancing at the life waiting beyond the doors. It was messy, unpredictable, full of risks and emotions he once believed he could not handle, yet he had never wanted anything more. Skylar reached over and took his hand, her engagement ring catching the faint evening light, a symbol not just of a proposal but of a future rebuilt from broken pieces into something stronger than before. They walked inside together, no longer two people hurt by the past but a family bound by everything they survived and everything they chose to become. And though life would always hold challenges, their hearts had finally found their way home, where love was not a weakness but the greatest strength they would ever know.